Hello and a very warm welcome to Story English Podcast.
Yes, welcome back everyone to the channel where we explore British life through storytelling.
I am Clara, and as always, I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Daniel.
It is great to be here, Clara, especially for today's topic, which is truly close to my heart.
Today, we are diving into a classic British obsession in an episode titled The Great British Queue Debate.
Ah, the queue, our national sport, our greatest pride, and perhaps our most misunderstood habit.
Exactly, but we're asking a bigger question today. Is the traditional British queue finally coming to an end?
It is a scary thought for some, but our story today might just provide an answer.
Before we start the story, we have 3 language takeaways for you to listen out for today.
First, we will look at the phrase to be at the end of your tether, which is very useful.
Then we will explore the verb to faff, which describes a very specific kind of British behaviour.
Finally, we will focus on the grammar of the third conditional for talking about regrets or missed chances.
So, settle in, grab a cup of tea, and listen closely to our story of a very long wait.
The scene begins on a grey Tuesday morning in London, outside a very trendy new bakery.
The air was damp and smelled of wet pavement and, more importantly, fresh sourdough and cinnamon.
Our protagonist, Arthur, stood precisely 3 feet behind a woman in a very expensive green coat.
Arthur was 72 years old and had spent approximately 4 years of his life waiting in mine.
He considered himself a professional, a grand master of the art of standing still and looking patient.
But today the queue was not moving and the drizzle was starting to soak into his flat cap.
He checked his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest.
If I had stayed in bed, he thought, I would be warm and dry right now.
But Arthur wanted those specific cakes for his granddaughter's birthday, and he was a man of his word.
Behind him, a young man was tapping his phone screen with a rhythmic, irritating clicking sound.
Incredulous, Arthur noticed that the young man was standing far too close, almost touching Arthur's rucksack.
This was the first sign of the collapse of civilization, Arthur whispered to himself.
He felt the urge to turn around and explain the rules of personal space in a public queue.
But being British, he simply sighed very loudly and adjusted his umbrella to create a barrier.
"Excuse me," the woman in the green coat said, turning around with a look of pure exhaustion.
Arthur blinked and looked at her, noticing the dark circles under her tired eyes.
"Do you happen to know if they are actually serving anyone in there?" she asked.
Arthur looked at the shop window, where a neon sign flickered but no staff were visible.
"I should think so," Arthur replied, though his own confidence was beginning to crumble like a stale biscuit.
Then the young man behind them spoke up, his voice full of modern impatience.
"This is a joke," he said. "I could have ordered these on an app and been home by now."
Arthur felt a sharp sting of annoyance at the mention of apps replacing real, honest waiting.
"A queue is a contract," Arthur said, surprising even himself with the firmness of his voice.
The woman in the green coat smiled, a small and weary expression of shared suffering.
"I am Sarah," she said, "and I am honestly at the end of my tether with this morning."
Arthur felt his frustration melt away as he looked at Sarah's shivering shoulders.
"It is the uncertainty that gets you, isn't it?" Arthur said, offering a corner of his umbrella.
They stood there for another 20 minutes, 3 strangers bound by a line that refused to move.
A bus splashed through a puddle nearby, sending a spray of cold water towards their ankles.
Sarah gasped as the water hit her shoes, and Arthur felt a surge of protective anger.
"This is becoming a bit of a shambles," the young man added, looking at his wet trainers.
"I'm Leo, by the way," he said, finally putting his phone into his pocket.
Arthur nodded, acknowledging the third member of their desperate little tribe.
He began to think about all the queues he had stood in over the decades.
Post offices in the 70s, bus stops in the rain, ticket offices for trains that never came.
There was a dignity in it once, Arthur thought, a sense of shared purpose and quiet respect.
But looking at Leo and Sarah, he saw only stress and the pressure of a world moving too fast.
Suddenly, the bakery door creaked open, and a young woman with flour on her apron stepped out.
Everyone in the queue leaned forward at once, like a field of wheat caught in a sudden breeze.
"I am so sorry," the worker said, "but our ovens have broken down completely."
A collective groan went up from the 30 people standing in the cold London rain.
"We won't be able to sell anything for at least 3 hours," she continued.
Sarah looked like she might actually cry, her hands clenching the fabric of her coat.
"If the ovens hadn't broken, I would be buying those cakes right now," Arthur mused sadly.
It was the crisis he had feared, the total failure of the system he respected so much.
Leo sighed and looked at his watch, but he didn't walk away immediately.
"Well, that was a colossal waste of time," Leo said, though his tone was surprisingly gentle.
Arthur looked at Sarah, then at Leo, and felt a strange reluctance to leave them.
They had shared 40 minutes of their lives in the rain, and that meant something.
"There's a cafe just around the corner," Arthur said, his voice hesitant but hopeful.
They don't have fancy sourdough, but they do a very decent cup of builder's tea.
Sarah looked up, a glimmer of interest returning to her tired face.
And they definitely won't faff around with broken ovens, Arthur added with a wink.
Leo laughed, a bright sound that seemed to cut through the grey morning fog.
"I think I could use a tea," Leo admitted, "and I promise to keep my phone in my pocket."
The three of them walked away from the broken bakery, leaving the ghost of the queue behind.
The cafe was warm and smelled of fried bread and cheap coffee, which felt like heaven.
As they sat down at a sticky plastic table, Arthur realised his frustration had vanished.
He watched Sarah relax as she took her first sip of hot, milky tea.
He listened as Leo talked about his job in graphic design, which sounded like another language to Arthur.
But they were talking, really talking, in a way that people rarely do in the city.
The queue had failed in its primary purpose of delivering cake, but it had succeeded in something else.
It had stripped away the anonymity of the street and forced 3 different souls to connect.
If I had been served quickly, I would never have spoken a word to these people.
Arthur smiled to himself, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea.
Perhaps the British queue isn't about the waiting at all, he thought.
Perhaps it is about the shared endurance of the absurdities of life.
"You know," Sarah said, leaning forward, "I think I prefer this to the sourdough anyway."
Leo nodded, his mouth full of a very large bacon sandwich.
They stayed there for over an hour, long after the rain had stopped and the sun tried to peek out.
When they finally said goodbye, there were genuine smiles and even a quick, awkward handshake.
Arthur walked to the bus stop, his legs a bit stiff, but his heart feeling surprisingly light.
He saw another queue forming for the number 38 bus and joined it without a second thought.
He stood 3 feet behind a man in a bowler hat and waited with perfect British patience.
The queue wasn't ending, Arthur decided. It was just changing its shape.
And as long as there were people to wait with, the wait was always worth it.
That brings us to the end of our story about Arthur and his morning in the rain.
It is such a lovely thought, Daniel, that something as boring as a queue can bring people together.
It really is. And now it is time for us to look at the language from the story.
We have some great British phrases to explain, starting with "to be at the end of your tether."
We heard Sarah say this when she was feeling very stressed and exhausted by the situation.
This phrase means you have no more patience or energy left to deal with a difficult situation.
Think of a tether as a rope holding an animal to a post. If you are at the end, you can't go any further.
It is quite a casual phrase, often used with friends or family when you are feeling overwhelmed.
You might hear a parent say it after a long day with screaming children.
A common mistake is saying end of my string, but in British English it is always tether.
To sound natural, try linking the words. At the end of becomes at the end of very quickly.
Why don't you try saying it out loud now? I am at the end of my tether.
Great. Now let's talk about that very British verb we mentioned, to faff.
Arthur used this when he talked about the bakery faffing around with broken ovens.
To faff means to spend time doing things that are not important or to be indecisive.
It is often used as to faff about or to faff around, and it is very common in the UK.
If your friend is taking too long to get ready to go out, you might tell them to stop faffing.
It carries a tone of slight annoyance, but is usually quite light-hearted and not too rude.
In terms of pronunciation, the double F at the end is very soft and breathy.
You can also use it as a noun, like saying, that task was a bit of a faff.
Now, let's move on to our core grammar pattern for today, the third conditional.
We heard Arthur use this in his inner thoughts during the story several times.
He thought, if I had stayed in bed, I would be warm and dry right now.
Wait, that is actually a mixed conditional, but he also used the pure third conditional.
He thought, if the ovens hadn't broken, I would have bought those cakes by now.
We use the third conditional to talk about imagined situations in the past that did not happen.
The structure is if plus the past perfect, followed by would have plus the past participle.
It is often used to express regrets or to imagine how things could have been different.
For example, if I had caught the earlier train, I would have arrived on time.
Another example, if she had studied harder, she would have passed the exam.
And one more, if it hadn't rained, we would have gone for a walk in the park.
A great tip for sounding natural is to use contractions like I'd instead of I had.
And would have often sounds like would have in fast, natural British speech.
Try saying this one with me. If I'd known, I would have helped.
Excellent. Now let's dive into some of the culturally rich vocabulary from Arthur's morning.
We used the word shambles to describe the messy situation at the bakery.
A shambles is a state of total confusion or a very badly organized event.
It is a very common British way to complain about public transport or government plans.
You might say the meeting was a total shambles because nobody knew what was happening.
We also used the term builder's tea when Arthur suggested going to the cafe.
This refers to a very strong cup of black tea, usually served with milk and 2 sugars.
It is the kind of tea that is supposed to give you the strength to build a house.
It suggests a place that is simple, honest, and not at all fancy or expensive.
Then we had the word rucksack, which is what we call a backpack in British English.
It is a standard, everyday word used by everyone from school children to hikers.
We also described the light rain as drizzle, which is a very British weather word.
Drizzle is that fine, misty rain that seems to get you wetter than a heavy downpour.
It is a very common feature of the British climate, sadly for us.
Another great word was sourdough, which is a type of bread that has become very trendy.
In the story, it represents the modern, expensive changes that Arthur's finds a bit confusing.
We also used the word flat cap to describe the traditional hat Arthur was wearing.
It is a rounded cap with a small, stiff brim, often associated with the working class or the countryside.
It gives Arthur a very specific, traditional British look in our minds.
Finally, we used the word groan to describe the sound the crowd made when the bakery closed.
A groan is a deep, long sound showing pain, unhappiness, or in this case, disappointment.
It is a very physical word that really helps the listener feel the mood of the scene.
I think that covers our main language points for today's episode.
We really hope you enjoyed the story and found these explanations helpful for your learning.
Why not try to use one of these phrases, like faffing around, in your own life this week?
Or perhaps you can tell us about a time you were at the end of your tether in the comments.
We absolutely love hearing your stories, and we read every single comment you leave.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to the Story English podcast channel.
We release new stories every week to help you master real British English in a fun way.
Thank you so much for spending your time with Arthur, Sarah, Leo, and us today.
It has been a pleasure as always, and we will see you in the next cue.
Take care of yourselves and keep practicing your English through the power of stories.
Goodbye for now, and happy learning to all our listeners around the world.